I'm Christina Marinakis, and I'm one of the directors of jury research at Litigation Insights. I am truly amazed by the amount of interest generated by this programming and the tremendous turnout we have today. To our loyal clients, we thank you for your continued partnership, and we really miss seeing you during what is usually a busy conference season. And to the folks whom we haven't had the pleasure of working with just yet, we look forward to connecting with you in the near future. I wish I could see all of your faces right now, but until I get a bigger monitor, I will direct you to one of the newer faces at Litigation Insights, Dr. Nick Polavin. Nick has a PhD in communication with studies in persuasion, decision-making, cognitive biases, and group dynamics. He has 7 years of experience in jury and social psychology study and research, and his professional and academic research has focused on how people make decisions and the factors that influence those decisions. Now, because we have a variety of folks on the line, I just wanted to give a brief introduction of our firm. Litigation Insights is a full-service litigation consulting firm offering jury research services such as focus groups, mock trials, and large-scale surveys, along with jury selection assistance in the form of voir dire preparation, in-court assistance with jury selection, and internet research of potential mock jurors. We also have a graphics and demonstrative development section and can assist with video deposition editing and in-court technology support. I'll now hand the reins over to Nick, who will be discussing the use of strategy, psychology, and communication to improve settlement negotiations. Nick will be pausing periodically throughout the program today to address any questions or comments that might arise. So we welcome you to submit your thoughts by typing them at any time in the questions section, which is located toward the bottom of your control panel. If we aren't able to get to your questions on the call today, we'll be sure to follow up with you individually by email. With that, Nick, I'll let you get started.
Thank you, and thank you to everyone for joining today. Today, I'm going to be talking about how to reach better outcomes in negotiations. And we'll start by talking about negotiation and strategy, and then the importance of keeping your eye on the end goal. And then we'll go into how humans make decisions, and then I'll go into some psychological and communication factors that influence negotiation. So why is it that mediations and settlements fall through? Well, both sides walk in with psychological and communication barriers, and we're here to break down some of those barriers and increase the likelihood of reaching an agreement. Generally, two parties will negotiate to the middle, but negotiation isn't just throwing out numbers, moving closer to the middle every time. There are psychological factors that impact the offers and demands, and the steps that you take can communicate a motive. And we'll talk about how these factors and how you can use them to help your negotiations. When reaching a settlement, there are multiple moving parts to consider. I'm sure some of you have felt constrained by the authority that you've been given or the policy limits that are in place. And sometimes the plaintiff makes an extreme demand, and you're also considering what is fair. So you might be wondering, what are the strategies to come in under what I have authority for? And if we always negotiate to the middle, how do I end up with an agreement that is closer to my end goal? Or should I even bother trying if the plaintiff is demanding so much that reaching an agreement is almost certainly impossible? Well, we'll go through the factors that will help in these situations and provide a strategy to increase your odds of reaching a favorable outcome. So before we get into the nitty-gritty, let's talk about negotiation strategy and preparation. Let's say there's an accident between a semi-truck and a car. The driver of the car decides to sue. The trucking company is insured, and the policy limit is $500,000. So it's important to keep any agreement under that level. The plaintiff is injured, so they make a demand. They think their back injury is worth $320,000, but we think it's worth $280,000. Now, in this situation, negotiating to the middle will result with something right around $300,000. But it might be the case that the plaintiff demands $380,000. They might be overstating their position. And if we still think it's worth $280,000, this is a situation that we don't want to get caught in, because a negotiation to the middle will end up with something probably above $300,000. On the other hand, this situation would probably be good for us. The plaintiff could demand $320,000, but even though we might think it's worth $280,000, we could start less to try to minimize any loss. And here, a negotiation to the middle would probably end up with something below $300,000. Or it could be the case that both sides overstate their position. But by starting with a lower offer, you can still prevent the agreement from going over $300,000. Ultimately, you've got to play the game. And if you start lower, the worst outcome that you could get is still the middle ground. Now let's talk about keeping your eye on the end goal. The most important strategy to keep in mind for negotiation is to keep your eye on the end goal. When planning, think about where different steps will take you and whether it will get you closer to your end goal or not. So this is a decision tree, a small form. This could go on further in either direction. But for the sake of this presentation, it's abbreviated. And here, number one is going to be the defense's first offer. So the plaintiff might have already made a demand before that, but we're going to start with the defense's first offer. And you could be considering a moderate offer or a lower offer. Sticking with the previous example, let's say that you make a moderate offer and offer $280,000. Well, the plaintiff might be more likely to accept this than a lower offer, but still they're probably going to counter. And let's say they come back with a demand of $380,000. Well, you're not going to accept that because that's still too high. You're probably not going to reject that and just go to trial. And if you make a counter offer, it might be $300,000. But let's look at what happens if we make a lower offer. If you start with $220,000, well, the plaintiff is going to be less likely to accept that, more likely to reject, but still probably going to make a counteroffer. Let's say they come back with a demand of $360,000. Now, that's lower than their demand in the above example, and there's a psychological effect that explains why this can happen, and we'll discuss that later. But that's still too high for us, so we don't accept it, and we don't just want to go to trial. We come back with a counteroffer of $250,000. Notice in this case, there are two things that are beneficial. One, the offer is still under what we think the injury is worth. And two, a $30,000 concession was made rather than a $20,000 concession. So starting lower allows us to make larger concessions, and these concessions can communicate a motive in negotiations. The larger concession you can make, the more it communicates a motive that you're really trying to help out an injured party, that you're really doing your best to reach an agreement. So when you're thinking about and preparing for your negotiation, think through the outcomes that you want, that you'd be happy with, and work backwards as you plan ahead. So you need to think through, these are the decisions that I need to make in order to get to that end goal. So when you're preparing, figure out where you want to end up. In this example, it was less than $300,000. After you come up with what your end goal is, think about the worst case scenario. Set a reservation price or a walkaway value. This is the point where trial is the better outcome, where you'd rather risk going to trial than pay a settlement. And when thinking about this, there are a few things to consider. The cost of the settlement, the cost of trial, the probability of winning the trial, the consequences of losing the trial, and if you do lose, what's the possible jury award? Could there be a bad faith claim by the insured? And what's the cost of losing the bad faith claim? It's important to do your research to best inform your walkaway value. We often have clients come to us to do a search of verdicts and settlements within a jurisdiction, by injury type, or even for a specific attorney to see what settlements they have agreed to in the past. It's important to prepare yourself with this information to know at what point you should walk away. And the last thing to do is try to figure out the counterparty's minimum. No, that's not something that you can definitely figure out, but try to estimate what it is that they're going to be accepting without going to trial. So here, let's say your walkaway value is $330,000 and you'll accept anything less than that. And their walkaway value is $270,000 and they'll accept anything more than that. The good news is that there's overlap here, so an agreement can be made. Now, the best you can do here is $270,000, but something near that might also be considered a good agreement for the defense. And something over that, however, could be considered a win for the plaintiff. So we're going to discuss some strategies to end up in the bottom half of this overlap. So we discussed the importance of keeping your eye on the end goal. Next, we'll get into some psychological phenomena that influence negotiations. First, let's look at how humans make decisions. The human brain actually uses two systems when processing information and making decisions. This research comes from Dr. Kahneman, who is the only psychologist to ever win a Nobel Prize in economics, because his research shows how people think about numbers and money. So this is especially important to think about in negotiations. Now, system one is a more rational system that uses effortful thought, doing calculations, basing decisions on data and on information. But system two, on the other hand, is a more emotional system that relies on intuitions and gut feelings. And we might hope that for something as important as a settlement discussion, we would only rely on the rational system. However, the problem is that both systems are particularly active during some of the most important decisions that we make. So it will be helpful to convince both systems when reaching an agreement in a negotiation. So now let's look at how different psychological factors affect these two systems of the brain and the decisions that we make. First, we'll go through some of Dr. Kahneman's heuristics. And a heuristic is just a mental shortcut. We don't like to spend mental effort. So to avoid doing this, we use these shortcuts. And there's a long list of heuristics that are studied in psychology, but we'll focus on just a few that are particularly relevant for negotiations. And of the ones that he studies, we're going to go over anchoring and adjustment, loss aversion, risk aversion, and availability. So anchoring and adjustment, this is the effect where a person bases their decision and responses on an initial value. And they know that that initial value isn't correct, so they try to adjust from that. And the adjustment from this anchor is insufficient. So ultimately, the first number has an impact that biases the decision. For example, I'll give you guys a few seconds to think about this. When was George Washington elected president? So research has asked this question to subjects, and a lot of people say 1780 or somewhere around there. The truth is that he was elected president in 1789. But here, the anchor that people usually use is 1776. That's when the US was founded. And then they think, well, he was elected a few years after that. And so they make an insufficient adjustment. So that anchor ultimately biases their decision. And this is relevant. It makes sense that people would use 1776 as a shortcut, but this effect is so strong that it holds for completely irrelevant numbers as well. One study gave judges information about a criminal case, and they were asked how long the defendant should be sentenced to jail. Before answering, they rolled loaded dice. The judges weren't aware that they were loaded, but the loaded dice were either rolled to a 3 or a 9. And so the half of the judges who rolled a 3 ended up sentencing the defendant on average to 5 months in jail. And those who rolled a 9 ended up sentencing the defendant on average to 8 months in jail. So this effect is so strong that it's even present for experts. And because of the anchoring and adjustment heuristic, there is a first mover advantage in negotiation. In our example, the plaintiff with the back injury demands $380,000, then that becomes the anchor. And I know it's not usually the case, but if you give the initial offer, then you set the anchor. And so that helps with the first mover advantage. This effect is also present for people with training in negotiations regarding coming to an agreement on a dollar value. There was a car negotiation study, and half of the subjects were told that they were sellers and they needed to sell the car for anything more than $2,500, and they wanted to maximize profit. The other half were buyers. And they were told that they couldn't spend more than $7,000 on the car, but to try to minimize the cost. Well, the study found that for every $100 added to the seller's initial bid, the agreement increased by $28. And for every $100 reduced from the buyer's initial bid, the agreement decreased by $15. So this shows the power of the first number proposed in negotiation. But there's an exception to this first mover advantage. It depends on the range of the estimated minimum. Sometimes it can be better to go second. Continuing with the example, if you hope to reach an agreement for $280,000, and you think the range of their estimated minimum is between $100,000 and $400,000, it can be better to go second. You don't want to offer $220,000 if their walkaway value is $100,000. You want to hear no at some point, or else you likely gave too much. On the other hand, you don't want to offer $50,000 if their minimum is $400,000. That might cut off communication because they might be offended by the offer. And what should you do when the counterparty sets an extremely high anchor? Well, there are two things that you could do. One, I would recommend you quickly give a counteroffer, because the longer that their number is set in their mind as a potential settlement, the stronger that anchor will become. So giving a counteroffer quickly won't allow that anchor to really take hold for a long time. You can also decline and tell them to come back with a realistic demand. This is risky, but research has shown that this will almost completely erase the effect of the initial anchor, because ultimately they're creating the next anchor. Another strategy that some people try is called a phantom anchor, where they set their own anchor and adjust off of that right away to look like they're making a concession. If you say, well, I was going to offer 200,000, but I'll actually offer 220,000. The problem is that can actually be viewed as manipulative, and in the end, that won't help the result of the negotiation. But manipulativeness can be reduced if there's some sort of information presented that supports the phantom anchor, so it's perceived as a true concession. I was all set to offer 200,000. In cases very similar to this, that's what we've reached settlements on, but I'll bump it up to $220,000 because we understand how important this is to you. So that provides some sort of information that really makes it seem like a concession, and that can help. Next heuristic we'll talk about is loss aversion. And before we get into that, I'm going to go through two examples. And I've used this example many times when I've given this presentation in the past and when I taught classes at Ohio State, but particularly timeful right now. So imagine your country is threatened by the outbreak of an unusual disease. There are two possible programs to combat the disease with different effectiveness estimates. In a group of 600 people, if you choose program A, 400 people will die. If you choose program B, there is a 1 in 3 probability that nobody will die and a 2 in 3 probability that 600 people will die. Note that program B is an all or nothing. There's not an in between there. So I'll give you a few seconds to decide and to write down which plan you would choose. Okay, now let's look at this next example. A hurricane took an unexpected turn and will be hitting the panhandle of Florida. The governor is considering one of two possible evacuation plans with different effectiveness estimates. In a group of 600 people, if program A is enacted, 200 people will be saved. If program B is enacted, there is a 1 in 3 probability that 600 people will be saved and a 2 in 3 probability that nobody will be saved. And again, here program B is all or nothing. There's not an in between. So which plan would you choose? So you might have noticed this, but the first example was framed in terms of losses. How many people will die? The second example was framed in terms of gains. How many people will be saved? Even though they were the same outcomes. And research has replicated this study over and over and consistently finds that around 70 to 80% of people choose program B in that first example because they want to avoid a certain 400 deaths. But in the second example, even though they were the same options, usually around 70 to 80% of people choose program A, and that's to ensure a gain of 200 lives. So here are the examples again right next to each other. Program A, 400 people will die. And again, this is out of 600 people. So program A, for example, 200 people will be saved, and that's the same outcome. But people like to avoid thinking about losses. And this is important for negotiations because as you're trying to negotiate down to a lower amount, they can easily perceive this to be a loss. So make sure that you talk about it as a gain. You can say that is a bit high, but what I can give you is, and you can reinforce this by saying what it will pay for. We'll pay 3 times your medical bills, and that will help pay for your daughter to go to college, and you'll have some money to invest. And this keeps their focus on what they are gaining rather than what they're losing by accepting your offer. On the other hand, you can use this heuristic to talk about what they could lose if they don't come to an agreement. If we can't agree on a number, then you risk losing X amount of dollars and ending up with nothing. And temporal discounting helps with this as well. And that's just an effect that people like having things now. Research has shown that most people would rather have $10 today than $20 a week from today. I'm sure you've all heard the J.G. Wentworth commercial called J.G. Wentworth 877 Cash Now. Well, that's because people would rather have money today than tomorrow. So if you talk about a settlement as cash in hand and talk about the chance to invest it or get interest from it, that can help. And you can back that up by talking about the length of litigation. Appeals can drag this out and keep your client from having money. Risk aversion is another heuristic that's similar to loss aversion. Risk aversion describes the effect that people like to avoid risks so much that it can bias their decision making. But this is a good thing for us. You want the counterparty to be risk averse. The best alternative to a negotiated outcome is trial, where they could get nothing. So, you can highlight the risk of ending up with nothing if an agreement isn't reached. And this should work particularly well for people who are generally risk averse. Research has shown that women, people who are married, elderly people, or people of lower education are generally more risk averse. And those are just demographics that aren't the best predictors, but you can try to figure it out for yourself. If it's someone who is a motorcyclist or likes extreme sports, they're probably not risk averse. So this might not be effective for them. But someone who has a solid retirement plan already saved up, they probably are risk averse. And so for people like that, you can, remind them a bird in the hand is worth two in the bush. And you can stand your ground a bit more in negotiations with these people because they will not like the chance that they end up with nothing if they go to trial. Another heuristic is called the availability heuristic. And this is the effect that things that are easy for us to recall are given extra weight when making decisions. Research has shown that when people think about active shooter situations and how often they occur, people severely overestimate how often they occur because whenever they happen, they get a significant amount of media coverage. So that's easy for people to recall. Especially with recent media coverage, people overestimate this. So for negotiations, focus the conversation on the parts of the offer that the counterparty likes. If a majority of the conversation focuses on a point of disagreement, then that will be given the extra weight when they're thinking about their offer, which will probably make them more likely to reject it. But if you're focusing on what you're agreeing to, then they'll focus their attention on that, which can help them in accepting your offer. The plaintiff attorney might also try to use this against you if there was a recent high verdict in a case that's similar. Plaintiffs might be making a very high demand. Well, to combat that, you can rattle off defense verdicts to bring it down and help counter the availability heuristic. And just advice for you, each case is its own. Don't rely on the outcome of the last negotiation or the last claim for this one. If the last trial had a huge punitive damages award, that doesn't mean you should avoid trial at all costs this time. So other psychological factors that we'll discuss include priming, reciprocity, consistency, and liking. And then at the end, we'll go over how to defend against these. So priming is when the perception or experience of something makes it more likely to come to mind later. Research has shown that when people vote in precincts that are in schools, they're significantly more likely to support spending on education. And that's because they're primed with the idea of education and the benefits that it has. So for negotiations, it's important to have positive interactions prior to the negotiation. But try to minimize and really try to prime agreeableness. You can say, I'm looking forward to working with a fair and respected person like yourself in order to reach an agreement. You want to help them come in with the idea that they're going to be open to working with you towards an agreement. Reciprocity is another important factor. And this is the desire to pay back someone after they have done something for you. So to do this, you can initiate the giving. And by starting with a lower offer, this allows you to make a large first concession that can really communicate that you're really trying to help them. It can be a sign of a show of good faith. You know, this sets the tone for the negotiation. The smaller concessions can come later toward the end to stay below, you know, the point that you would like to, but start with a large first concession to make them want to pay you back by doing the same. And to really bolster this, you can personalize it. What we're willing to do for you is add in $20,000 to bring the offer from $220,000 up to $240,000. But it's important to make it unexpected in a good way. You know, if they're expecting you to make a concession of $10,000, and if you do that, then they won't think that they need to pay you back for that. But if you make it $20,000 when they're expecting $10,000, that will help make them feel like they owe you something in return, make them feel like they need to reciprocate that. So again, the large initial concession will do this. Another psychological heuristic that can impact negotiations is consistency. And this is the desire to behave in a way that you have in the past. And we actually get an uncomfortable feeling when we're inconsistent. So we really like to continue acting and behaving in the same way. So don't be too extreme with your first offer that they walk away. You know, make sure that it's high enough so that they'll want to give a counter demand. And that's because if they're giving counter demands now, that will lead to more counter demands later. And this is called the foot in the door technique in psychology or in marketing. That's trying to get someone to do something small now, which makes them more likely to do something larger in the future. And liking is another heuristic that's very important for negotiations. You know, people cooperate with people they like. People try to agree with people they like. And there was a study that showed how strong this can impact negotiations. The study showed that before getting into the negotiation, talking with the counterparty about points of mutual similarity or interest can actually help reach an agreement. In one study, half of the subjects were primed with telling them time is money, and the other half were told to get to know the counterparty first. And the people who were primed with time is money, only 18% of those pairs ended up reaching an agreement. But for the people who were told to get to know the counterparty first, 90% of those pairs actually reached an agreement. So something just as small as, you know, getting to know the other person and getting them to like you can actually have a very large effect in the end. So for you, you know, pick up the phone and call them rather than mail or email, and don't get right to business. This is your opportunity to be friendly and talk about similar interests. It's an opportunity for friendly communication with a positive tone, a good word choice, good inflections. So we've gone through how you can use some of these, but it's very possible that you might fall prey to them as well. So how can we defend against them for ourselves? Well, the very first thing you can do is just be aware of them. You know, if you realize that you like the counterparty, think about how that might be affecting your counteroffers. And really take a step back to think through the moves you're making. Are they truly helping you get to your end goal, or is there another reason why you're making those? So remember to stick to your plan throughout. You can also ask the opinion of someone who's not involved. You know, if you might want to ask someone who hasn't heard the initial number, they haven't heard the anchor. They might have had a different experience than your recent negotiation, which can remove the effect of the availability heuristic. If the person hasn't met the counterparty, then they won't have the liking heuristic influencing them. Or someone who hasn't been making counter offers because they won't have the consistency heuristic. So we've gone through psychological factors that can influence negotiations. Are there any questions before I get into the communication factors?
So for your first segment, someone asked, what you talked about the two systems that Condiment states people use in processing the financial decision. What was the second system that you mentioned?
So the first system was a rational, system. The second system was an emotional system that really bases your feeling on a gut feel, or bases a decision on a gut feeling or an intuition. And when you felt, your head is telling you one thing and your heart is telling you another, that's an instance where these two systems are in conflict. Sometimes they come to the same agreement, but sometimes they don't.
And in a related question, instead of convincing the emotional system, is there a way to decrease its influence?
Yeah, well, not completely. Research has shown that these two systems are especially active when we're making important decisions. People want to feel good about an agreement that they're coming to, and that feeling, that good feeling, comes from the emotional system. But it is possible. In many cases, plaintiffs are angry, and that can make the influence of the emotional system even stronger. But if you can take the emotional temperature down, that can help. We'll talk more about that later, but having positive interactions and making concessions can help set the impression that you're doing your best to help the injured party, and that can kind of temper any negative feelings that they have towards the defense.
There's another concern here that's related. They ask, what if I want to be likable, but the other party only believes that time is money? And so there's not a lot of time to show your likability to the other side.
Well, all you can do is, do the best you can. It might help to, go out of your way to go to them, to take them out to lunch. Everyone needs to eat lunch. So if you're willing to go out of your way to do whatever you can to come across as likable and to try to have that conversation to show that, you two can get along, and it's not just this head-to-head debate about a negotiation, that can help.
Some defendants will only negotiate with a claims rep on the phone. How can we let the plaintiff know that there's interest and not disinterest if there's not a rep on the phone?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
Some defendants will only negotiate with a claims rep on the phone. How can we let the plaintiff know that there's interest in reaching a settlement and not disinterest just by the mere fact that, the claims rep is not there?
Oh, well, over the phone is still better than email. At least you can still have verbal communication with them. So to that point, you can still, pick up the phone and say, ask them how they're doing. Right now, talk to them about what they're going through with the pandemic. If, they're working from home, how is business continuing? Or, if it's a sports season, you can talk about, what their local team had done. Something before jumping right into the conversation. It doesn't need to be in person. I would say that conversation over the phone can still be very productive.
You mentioned starting low so that you can show good faith by making large concessions, but don't you risk offending the plaintiff if you go too low? So how do you figure out what's too low and where the appropriate number is?
Yeah, that's a good question. There's not one right answer to that. So it'll need to be determined on a case-by-case basis. But you could consider settlements in similar cases. You need to think about what you have authority for and the concessions that you can make. And it helps if you're able to provide reasons why your anchor is legitimate and not offensive to the counterparty. If you can back that up with some sort of reasoning, then at the very least, it shouldn't be offensive. It still might be too low to them, but they'll see that you have good reason behind your number.
All right. Thank you, Nick. We can go ahead and move on to the next segment.
Okay. All right, so now we'll be talking about communication factors that influence the two systems of the brain in negotiation. And here we'll talk about setting impressions and being likable, the barriers to communication, and given those barriers, how you should communicate. And then we'll end up going through some other communication strategies. And a lot of this is helping to convince the emotional system. So how do you set a good impression and be likable even if you don't like the other side? Well, a lot of plaintiffs just want to be heard. So truly listen. Don't just wait to talk. Acknowledge the other person and what they're saying. You can say, I'm hearing that you think X amount is fair because of X, Y, and Z. And this is a signal, at the very least, to the counterparty that you're considering these factors too. And they can't just outright reject your offer thinking that they're being ignored. Also, make sure that you respect their point of view. If you've ever heard of I statements versus you statements, this is the time to think about that. So I statements would be something like, I don't see it that way, versus you statements would be like, you're wrong. And when you're using you statements, that's putting blame on the listener. And people get defensive and then they don't want to communicate and don't want to come to an agreement. But if you make sure you're using I statements, I don't see it that way. This is what I think is a more fair number. That puts responsibility on yourself and won't make them defensive. Also apologize without admitting fault. You may not like the plaintiff or their attorney. You may think the plaintiff is malingering. And, I recognize it might be difficult, but really, in order to break down barriers, they want to be heard. And apologizing, again, without admitting fault, can still help you do that. And think about how you're talking to them as well. Think about the verbal cues. Don't yell, don't talk over the other party, don't interrupt. Make sure that you have a positive tone. Think about nonverbals as well, if you can see them. If it's a video call or if you're in person, sit upright, have your shoulders open. That seems more inviting than crossing your arms or closing your hands or keeping your hands in your pockets. And make sure that you're using mannerisms and inflections that are friendly, that are positive, so they at least feel like you're getting along. And some people have used what's called the bullwhip strategy in negotiations. And this is where you start at a reasonable number and you don't move. The problem with this, it can work, but generally research has shown more often than not, it antagonizes and embarrasses the other party because they're the only ones making concessions and they don't like that. So try to, make a first offer so that you can make concessions to communicate that you're really trying your best to reach an agreement. Some of the barriers to communication, well, the first one that we've already talked about is offers that are too extreme can cut off negotiations, or an unwillingness to increase your offer can have the same effect. If they don't think that you're taking the claim seriously, they won't want to keep talks going. They won't want to continue negotiating. Also, take responsibility for what the counterparty hears. If the plaintiff thinks you're being rude and dismissive and that you don't care about what happened to them, then you need to change how you come across to them. In marketing, a common phrase is, it's not what you say, it's what they hear. And unfortunately, even though that might not be how you're trying to communicate, take responsibility for what they hear and adapt to continue keeping an open conversation. And then leave the conversation with value. Make sure that when you're talking to them, you're allowing them to contribute so that they'll want to continue talking in the future. If you're dominating the conversation, if you're not listening to them, then that's just going to make them less likely to want to continue talks in the future. And similarly, if the outcome isn't better, at least learn something about how to communicate with the counterpart. Take notes of what seemed to work and what didn't work. And you can use that going forward in your future communications with them. And at the very end of any discussion, it's important to verify that they understand your position. You want to make sure that you're on the same page. You can do this by writing down details, writing down numbers, and giving that to them or emailing them afterwards. If an agreement doesn't happen because there was a misunderstanding, then that's a problem that can easily be solved. So make sure that everyone is on the same page. And then how should you communicate? Make your request clear. Again, if there are a lot of details to your offer, try to put them in writing and go through them so that they're not going to misremember them and they're going to see exactly what you're offering. Also, communicate such that they want to listen to you and that they want to continue talking to you. Try to really hear them out and communicate openly. Don't focus on being right or on having your point of view accepted. focus on having a conversation. That's really what it should be. And if you can stick to that, even if you're not successful in reaching an agreement today, it will at least make it more likely that you can reach an agreement in the future. And lastly, we'll go through some other communication strategies. The rationale for picking numbers can be important. It's much more convincing if you can show how you got to your offer. To do this, you can itemize it. This is what this offer is going to pay for. And it also increases the availability of the things that they like in your offer. We took your medical expenses and doubled it. And so if you can provide a rationale, then they're not just going to think that you're just picking a number that's pretty low to try to get your client out of a sticky situation, but you're actually working to come to an agreement. And also think about using exact versus round numbers. This might seem really minor, but it's actually a powerful, effective strategy. People are more likely to agree to exact numbers because it implies that there's a good reason for it. So if you just look at this example, if you see $220,000 versus $219,400, that second number really communicates that there's probably a good reason for that. The first number is a round number and could have just been picked, on a whim. But the second number implies that there's something behind it. There's a good reason for that. And that will tell the counterparty that there's less wiggle room than they might think there is. And it can really be effective to switch from round numbers to an exact number when you think you're getting close to an agreement. That change will be apparent to them. You can back that up by saying, this is really the best we can do. And that will help them in seeing, they're serious about this number. We can't just get all the money that we want here. So what about mediated negotiations? If you can't communicate with the other party, how can you use these strategies? Well, at the very least, you can try to convey the same sentiments. The psychological factors will still be present with the offers and the counter offers. You can still use the anchoring and adjustment heuristic. You can still make concessions to show that you're really trying to come to an agreement. And you can think about how you can still utilize the communication factors. If it's possible, don't only communicate through a mediator. But if you are, you can think about the language you're using. Think about what your counteroffer communicates. And you can still provide the rationale for your counteroffer and provide an exact number that will show that you're really doing your best. And all these strategies that we went through, it's not just pick one and go with it. All of these can work together. And this is just an abbreviated example for the sake of this presentation, but let's just go through this. So because of X, Y, and Z, you think that $360,000 is fair. Is that correct? And that's showing that you're listening to the counterparty. Yes. Well, in thinking about the needs you have, and that's respecting their position and showing that there might be a different conclusion to it. I don't see it that way. I come to a different number. And so this is an I statement that doesn't attack them, that doesn't make them defensive. What I'm willing to do for you, this is invoking reciprocity, is give you $279,800. And here's an exact number to imply that there's minimal wiggle room and a reason for that number. Because that's what I think is fair, and let me tell you why. You'll take care of your medical costs. This will also help pay for your daughter's college and give you some money to invest for the future. And here's a rationale for your number. Make it more concrete so that they think that you can't actually keep increasing your offers that much more. If you reject this and we don't come to an agreement, you risk losing nearly $280,000 for your client. And that's the loss aversion heuristic. The outcome of a trial is never certain. That's the risk aversion heuristic. And your client will have cash in hand rather than waiting for trial and possible appeals. And that's temporal discounting. We're very sorry that your client is going through this tough situation, but let's reach an agreement to get this taken care of so he can move on with his life. And that's, there's your apology without admitting fault. That really helps add the human factor to this, that you're trying your best to help them out. you should always be communicating for the end goal. These all play into the strategy of keeping your eye on the end goal, thinking back to that decision tree and which outcomes you want, and then looking at the steps you need to take along the way to get to those outcomes is important. You know, not every step will be successful, but you can take each step knowing that an agreement in the future is more likely. And remember that it helps to convince both systems of cognition. If you make the counterparty feel good throughout the negotiation process, it will make it more likely that you'll reach an agreement with them that is favorable to your side. And you know, we can't go through everything here. So if any of you have a difficult situation in the future that you'd like to discuss, feel free to reach out to me and we can brainstorm about what's the best move going forward. Are there any other questions?
Yes, Nick, it seems that we have a couple. Just one second to pull those up. What about timing? How does that play into this? How does responding right away versus making the plaintiff wait affect negotiations?
So this is another one where it depends. Let's say, you know, waiting can actually, it can make them anxious, but it could also send the message that this isn't a priority for you or that you don't really care. So you need to be careful with that. And I would say it really depends on the mindset of the plaintiff. You know, if they're angry with you, if they don't believe that they are overstating their position, then it may have a negative effect by waiting.
I found that the bullware strategy can work. I've stuck to my guns a couple of times when the plaintiff has made an extreme demand, and it has worked twice. Do you have any thoughts about why that might have worked?
Much like the other answers, this I would also say it depends. But it's likely that if the plaintiff thinks that their demand is extreme and if they realize that they're overstating their position, then it may work. They're going to be more likely to come down. But if they think that their number is fair, then that might not work and that might just offend them.
Great. So I think we're pretty much out of time. I know people are ready to get back to their schedule. So I wanted to thank everyone for joining us today. And thank you, Nick, for sharing your insights. I hope that folks walk away with at least one or two things that they can apply in future negotiation. So thanks everyone for joining us. Look forward to having you back next time.
Thank you.